So I just wanted to start off by saying that Donald Ault was my um, dissertation director who died in 2018. And I've always wanted to write about him because he had a lot of interesting thoughts. And also I found that when Bruno Latour died, I think 2022, there were a lot of interesting intersections between their thinking. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be focusing on today. So this first slide is a photograph that Latour references in his 2008 lecture, What is the Style of Matters of Concern? The full title of the photograph is Adrian Walker, Artist, Drawing from a Specimen in a Laboratory in the Department of Anatomy at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, 1992. And he's sort of looking, a lot of people will talk about this in terms of like the the sort of genre or the aesthetics of the deeply focused scientist, right? Which is something that is fairly common, and also kind of looks like Rodin's thinker in some ways. So next slide, please. Latour sees the Adrian Walker photograph as exemplary of what he calls the aesthetics of matters of fact. He suggests that this aesthetic emerged in the 16th century as an outgrowth of linear perspective and projective geometry on the one hand, and the use of illustration to communicate scientific knowledge on the other. Each of these phenomena use a version of visual realism to convey the impression that evidence can speak for itself. So this aesthetics of matters of fact are opposed by what Denis Diderot calls theatrical art, or art which is turned explicitly toward the spectator. By turning away from their relation to the spectator, the aesthetics of matters of fact acts to bracket perspective off from scientific inquiry. I quote Latour at length to give you a sense of his style. Quote, when is it the case that you find yourself seated, quietly facing such a matter of fact? Most of our experience is not obtained that way. Instead, we run with a pack of simultaneous events running parallel to us. And tell me if by the most extraordinary contrivance, you are asked to be seated face to face with a piece of a dead body. When would you be requested, in addition, not to touch it, not to hold it in your hand, not to vomit on it out of disgust, but instead to draw it from a distance of about 40 centimeters, as if you wanted, through a feat of an even more extravagant anatomy, to detach its drawable shape from its undrawable material composition, end quote. So Latour sees the matter of fact, this notion that you can look at a fact face to face as implausible and contrived, and that there is nothing more amazingly artificial, more carefully staged, more historically coded than meeting a matter of fact face to face. Okay, next slide. So this second image I want to consider is William Blake's printed painting, Newton from 1805. Donald Ault reads Newton, visually conveying a muscular figure rolling himself into, quote, the very shape which that figure is measuring with dividers, end quote. The body is conforming to the drawing. The back reflects the curve on the drawing, while the lines making up the triangle on the drawing reflect how geometry is forming the body as a limit that is being imposed upon Newton. Ault says that these resonances between the body and the drawing reveal, quote, the extent to which the powerful imaginative body of the figure has been lured into a mathematical parody of itself, which I find to be an interesting phrase, mathematical parody. Next slide. So he continues that it seems that the foot is part of the rock, and that this suggests that, quote, it is the whole composition and not simply the human figure, which is Blake's Newton. It is the complexity of contrast and identity which makes the drawing so powerful. The human figure is constructing a limited, fixed, and unchanging model of its fundamental bodily experiences to stave off the sense of the dissolving quality of the world. Yet, and this is the most crucial point of all, it is the very act of constructing the model that separates our world into inner and outer, definite and indefinite, action and background, symmetry and asymmetry. And so when looking at it, like I got the impression that he was describing Newton as kind of this almost like a Lovecraftian monster, that he's, the coral rock, the beautiful coral rock in the left is being formed in the image of this hunched over, right, character who is drawing geometry on the paper, right? And that this is indicative, as Blake would say, of what Newton himself did. Next slide. So the Walker photograph and the Blake printed painting exemplify the same phenomenon, how the entangled relations of matters of concern are forced into the limited and unchanging aesthetics of matters of fact. What Latour sees as the artificial and contrived experience of meeting a fact face to face, Ault sees as the mathematical parity by which Newton forms his body as an unchanging bulwark against impermanence. So in this talk, I'm going to examine how Ault's visionary physics participates in Latour's broader project, defending science against not only fascism and misinformation, but also the abstraction of matters of fact from the entanglements defining matters of concern. For Latour, matters of concern shift, quote, attention from the stage to the whole machinery of a theater. This is what Latour calls a scenography, that is, an aesthetic and theatrical arrangement of scientific knowledge. I refer to Blake and Ault as understanding visionary experience as a mathematical scenography, given Ault's fascination with describing Blake's poetry using complex variables. That's something we'll get to at the second part of the talk. Here, mathematics is employed as an aesthetic and visionary experience, revealing the unchanging, impermanent, and fragile nature of facts. Next slide. So this shift references not only the theatricality of science, but also its embeddedness in a larger machinery that Maria Puig de la Pelacasa relates to a Heideggerian thing or gathering that, quote, makes patent the internal diversity of matters of fact, the blurred boundaries of its collective existence, as well as the mediations that make possible for it to hold together, as well as constantly build new associations. A thing conceived as such is then both construction and reality. So this thing about it being both construction and reality is contrasting sharply with what Latour identifies in his lecture as what Alfred North Whitehead calls the bifurcation of nature, which is a separation between perception and reality, nature and culture, and human and non-human actors. Whitehead, in particular, uses this idea to critique much of modern philosophy and science as introducing these separations inappropriately. Latour then appropriates this idea by proposing an irreductive science, one which embraces a broader range of actors, institutions, and practices. As Latour puts it in Irreductions, quote, what we call science is made up of a large array of elements whose power we prefer to attribute to a few. And so what Latour is saying, and I would argue that Ault is also saying this, is that we consider science to be a very particular thing that's bracketed off from other disciplines, and that is practiced in a certain way with labs, with scientists, right, and through grants, doing empirical research. And yet what they're trying to suggest is that we need to sort of focus on this irreductive science, that there are all these different practices, all of these different actors that are actually practicing science, but aren't seen as practicing science. So I'll focus on how this broader understanding of science as a matter of concern shows up in visionary physics before moving on to the more complicated mathematical scenographies found in the 1972 unpublished work on problems of perspective in Blake's Book of Urizen. Next slide. So I included this just because Ault also wrote about Donald Duck, and I had to include it. So his scholarship on the layouts of Donald Duck artist Karl Barks provide an example of this commitment to the perspectival analysis of mathematical scenographies. He calls these visionary synchronicities, in which, quote, gimmicks, tricky devices, and gags provide insight into the invisible interconnections operating from somewhere that seem to assert themselves only occasionally in everyday life when coincidences trigger chains of unlikely and irreversible events. And so in this piece, he's applying vector analysis, which is a method in calculus to differentiate and integrate vector fields to mathematically describe three-dimensional Euclidean space. And he uses this actually on comic book panels, which is odd but interesting, to analyze how the panels are actually revealing these karmic connections between events that seem unrelated. And so in this sequence from Walt Disney's Comics and Stories number 81, Donald is thrown into the path of a V-2 rocket while following a fake treasure map concocted by his nephews as a prank. And so the gag of the whole sequence is that despite the map being false, a series of coincidences nevertheless proves all of Donald's false beliefs to be true. Ault says this: what can't be seen, and this is particularly in this sequence, by the reader from the bird's eye view of the rocket is the invisible pinpoint image of Donald as he's running across the bullseye far below at the same time that the rocket is falling. These forms of simultaneity are invisible to Donald, and in a certain sense, even to the readers of Barks's comic, but they can be analyzed, right, and brought to the surface. They allow an imaginative override of this limitation and show how the comic page can exceed such literal representation of movement. So this essay sort of shows how irreduction is a hallmark of alt scholarship. Next slide. So this tone of frivolity and gags echoes a lot of the responses to visionary physics when it first appeared in 1972. Many scholars found Alt's commitment to irreducible perspective analysis confusing. So Jenny Joy LaBelle, who was a Blake scholar in the 70s, recalls introducing the book to physicist Richard Feynman, who was a, quote, admirer of Blake. Feynman valiantly struggled with the book for several days. Then, somewhat baffled, he returned to me and said, I don't know what this is, but it isn't physics. And this is typical. Those of you who've had Alt in a class back in the day can recall how this type of bizarre humor is sort of happening all the time when you're around him. So next slide. So much in the same way that Latour complicates the ontology of facts, Alt's relational reading of Blake and visionary physics complicates the notion that Blake's characters and ideas are stable entities. So his conceptual apparatus in the book is engaging with Blake's mythological ideas, but he's also careful not to reduce Blake's thought to a mythology or a system. He suggests that Blake replaces entities with relations and hopes, quote, to restore relational rather than normal intuitive thinking to the readers. Mythology in this scene is a framework within which ongoing relational transformations take place. And so he's still interested in Blake's myth, but he doesn't want to see it as a stable myth, but rather a kind of apparatus for introducing difference into our understanding of what myth is. In the conclusion, he notes that he finds it ironic that critics emphasize, quote, systemic connections in Blake. These connections are clearly the tools, the material, not the form of modulated vision, which makes Blake's poetry so compelling. And so all of the things that are occurring in Blake's poems are not like, they're not to be taken seriously in the sense of like considering these to be actual people, but they're there for according to Ault to perform this sort of these acts of modulation which make, corrode, and remake reality. An example is that the Urizen who appears in the Book of Urizen may not be the same Urizen as the one who appears in Milton, a poem, and that Urizen may not in turn be the same Urizen as the one who appears in Jerusalem. And so this is sort of an early version of what, we're much more aware of today. That is sort of theories of the multiverse in particular. So next slide. So visionary physics resists the bifurcation of nature described by Whitehead by rejecting the premise that the Newtonian universe is purely mechanistic and materialistic, suggesting that entanglements between Neoplatonism and materialism persist throughout Newton's thought. He reads Newtonian physics alongside Newton's theological and alchemical work to illuminate their tendencies to assimilate other systems of thought. His example is the argument from 18th century mystic William Law that Newton's three laws of motions were appropriated from the three properties of eternal nature espoused by German philosopher and theologian Jacob Boehme. Blake critics like Kevin Fisher and Robert Ricks have examined the influence of Boehme on Blake, but it is less clear how Boehme influenced Newton. So for Ault, the tendency of thinkers to see connections between Newton and Boehme quote, is our first obvious introduction to the power of Newton's scientific system to assimilate, even if only by analogy, the whole sweep of relations contained in Blake's imaginative cosmology. So in this sense, the biggest danger of Newtonian thinking isn't materialism, um, but its attempts to set up its own categories by purifying relations and establishing them as paradigmatic, after which, quote, scientific inquiry is necessarily restricted to a certain group of phenomena and a certain set of problems, which the paradigm has displayed as being especially revealing to the nature of things. And so Ault would always talk about how Blake was, in fact, quite inspired by Newton, but never trusted him, because what Newton would do would set up a framework whereby you were just sort of like responding to Newtonian systems and ideas. In incommensurable, oh, next slide, sorry. So in incommensurability and interconnection, Blake's anti-Newtonian text, Ault discusses this danger in terms of Newton's belief in the Prisca Sapientia. And this is the ancient wisdom that spoke of the unification of knowledge into a coherent doctrine and a single system. The wisdom was presumably revealed to Moses and passed through the Hermetic tablets, and united such disparate forms of thinking as, quote, biblical exegesis, alchemy, and scientific demonstration. Blake saw that explaining such a coherent system and world required, at the level of explanation, the rejection, suppression, and ruling out of massive aspects of human experience. And so the result of all of this is that until Einstein fundamentally challenged Newtonian thinking a centuries later, most scientific questions were conceptualized using Newtonian categories, even while Newton himself was not consistently Newtonian in his ideas or thinking. Next slide. But the interesting thing here is that even while Newton was doing this, he was creating what Latour would see as a sort of hybridity of Newtonian and anti-Newtonian thinking. Stephen Schaeffer talks about, for instance, that Newton's theory of gravity is unthinkable without his belief that angels were interplanetary beings. In Newton's words, quote, as the planets remain in their orbs, so may any other bodies have sufficient power of self-motion, move whether they will, place themselves where they will, and continue in any regions of the heavens whatsoever. They are to enjoy the society of one another, and by their messengers of angels to rule the earth and converse with the remotest regions. Latour talks about this idea in Facing Gaia, and he mentions Schaeffer's reading of Newtonian cosmology. And he concludes that, like, Newton's understanding of gravity, the interesting thing is that while he revises it later on to be a force rather than an entity, it consequently retains these traces of his magical thinking. Quote, through several hundred pages of angelology, Newton gradually managed to trim their wings and transform this new agent into a force, a purely objective force, of course, because it had answered the objections, but it was still it was still charged upstream by millennia of meditations on an angelic system of instant messaging. Even the most respectable entities, characters in novels, scientific concepts, technical artifacts, natural phenomena, are all born of the same witch's kettle. For it is literally here in this metamorphic zone that all the tricksters and all the shapeshifters reside. So in this sense, science is a scenology, it's aesthetic, it's theatrical, in which some actors and networks fade into the background and Newtonian acts of bifurcation, only to emerge once again when we analyze the scenology's machinery. The more complicated aspects of the scenology disappear once again after they are metaphorically made into more purifying terms like force that are associated with fact. The stakes of this metamorphic act parallel Ault's point about the relationship between characters in Blake's work and the modulated vision their drama enacts. Science inappropriately focuses on metaphors, not realizing how much they are being impacted by them in the development of theory. In this case, Ault knew only too well that, quote, only a radical reinterpretation of perspective in Blake which does not simply synthesize logic and dialectical methods, can something like the richness of Blake's poetry be a approach? If for Latour, the danger of Newton's thought comes from the slippage between metamorphic and metaphoric and its consequent wing-clipping objectivity-making bifurcation, for Ault, the danger of intuitive thinking lies in its satanic usurpation of the imagination into the limited framework of the matter of fact. As we'll see in Ault's approach to mathematical expressions to describe Blake's poems, the complicated ways Ault enacted modulated vision parallel Latour's sense of the aesthetics of matters of concern. In other words, the richness of Blake's poetry can only be understood for Ault if we take seriously Blake's work as a science of perspective. Next slide, please. Cool. Ault begins Problems of Perspective by restating a problem, animating much of his critical work on the Book of Urizen. Quote, the actions the poem presents are in some sense simultaneous, while the reader's perception of the actions is successive, end quote. Urizen is often read as a parody of the Book of Genesis, describing the creations of the heavens and the earth, the early history of Moses, and the exodus of the Jewish people from their captivity in Egypt. For Ault, the Book of Urizen reveals that these occurrences are, in actuality, the same event repeated over and over. Each iteration of this repeating event introduces characters made from the compounded perspectives of earlier iterations and who further alter the ontology of the world surrounding them. He introduces what I argue are mathematical scenographies as a means of tracking these changes. Ault articulates these scenographies through what mathematicians call complex variables. Complex variables extend the set of real numbers with imaginary numbers using a variable called I, which is expressed in the equation I squared equals -1. In this instance, I would be the square root of -1, which has no solution if understood to be a real number. If I is an imaginary number, then the equation can be solved. Real numbers generally measure continuous one-dimensional qualities and are foundational to calculus. Imaginary numbers were originally thought to be useless, but since the 19th century, imaginary variables have proven to be indispensable in solving a wide variety of geometric and algebraic equations. Complex variables are used to extend the use of real numbers. One example is the Nyquist stability criterion, which uses complex variables to graph the stability of dynamic systems. Besides their poetic resonances to Blake, who thought, quote, imaginary things alone are real, these numbers enable Ault to graph the Book of Urizen as the dynamic interaction between its characters who are actually complex variables mathematically enacting modulated vision. Next quote. Next slide, sorry. Consider the first few lines of Urizen, which complicate both the subject and the temporality of creation. Quote, lo, a shadow of eternity is risen, a shadow of horror is risen in eternity, unknown, unprolific, self-closed, all repelling. What demon hath formed this abominable void? The soul-shuddering vacuum. Some said it is Urizen, but unknown, abstracted, brooding secret, the dark power hid. Time in this sequence is actively marked low, while Urizen's first appearance is as an object dimly viewed. Ault's intervention reminds us that we are witnessing the assembling of time and perspectives as reciprocal functions of one another. Quote, it is useful to account for the order of actions in the Book of Urizen as increasingly derivative composites of perspectives whose primitive components are constituted by an initial set of relationships. The order of events in the poem are a set of superimposed perspectives. While subsequent perspectives are more complex and derivative, Ault points out that they are also more constricted given the limits placed by newer perspectives interacting with them. The sense that Urizen has an initial set of relationships is also partly misleading, since Blake's narrative technique superimposes previous perspectives into the moment occurring in the present. Quote, each new perspective in the poem is some composite of previous perspectives rather than simply a linear succession. By the end of the poem, we are in a set of perspectives which are totally derivative. None of the initial perspectives remain except as radically transformed in their reappearance in successive composite functions. The Book of Urizen describes a narratological actor network in which each perspective is composed of other perspectives and which have causal relationships with each other. The eternity mentioned in the beginning of the poem is not simply a moment, but what Jules van Lieshout calls a recursive moment. It is the infinite structure of periods within moments, within periods, within moments. This quasi-causal relationality of perspectives constructs the temporality that retroactively is seen as a linear progression of events. For Ault, quote, the act of seeing through is itself the emergence of the new perspective, end quote. Reading Urizen actively constructs the poem as a series of intuitive perspectives, and each of these perspectives actively sustains one another. And so Blake is being somewhat metatextual here, right? Where he's saying that every time we read the Book of Urizen, we're actually enacting the thing that is being described in the poem. We are somehow hailed into the act of creation, which is ongoing. Next slide. Ault offers the following sets of complex variables to describe the scenographies he outlines in the essay. And the first one is the aspect of Urizen under the perspective of Eternals as, quote, obscure, shadowy, void, solitary, a dark power, a petrific, abominable chaos, a power which is hidden and secret, unknown, designated by Ault as ET of U or U1, the aspect of Urizen under the perspective of Urizen as a victor over, quote, monster sin bred, creator of a solid without fluctuation and a world of law dwelling in a void, designated by U of U or U2, the aspect of the Eternals under the perspective of the Eternals as expanding and contracting sense perception, by implication, light, definite knowability, eternal life, and an organization which they perceive U1 as chaos, designated by ET of ET or E1. And finally, the aspect of the Eternals under the perspective of Urizen as living in unquestionable burnings, fluctuations, forces which die, designated by U2 of ET or E2. And so when Ault is doing this, he's setting up all of these perspectival functions as complex variables. Aspect 1 is the Urizen created by Eternals who are created when Urizen views them. And so there's this reciprocal moment of creation. Ault's expressions do not simply ascribe a phenomenological relation to a stable entity, but the way in which entities and relations, qua entities and relations, emerge as such. Aspects are cognitive acts. The existence, quote, of Urizen, separate from the Eternals, derives from the very existence of these perspectives, end quote. And so it's not like we're viewing something that's happening, but rather that our viewing is actually making it happen. And it's happening right now when we read the poem. A shift in these relations also impacts the ontology of the narrative world described by the poem. Chapter 1 is very simple, relatively speaking, since it is the first aspect. Chapter 2 immediately adds complexity with the expression E1, E2 becoming U2, which indicates that it is told from a perspective combining the Eternals as they see themselves with the perspective of the Eternals as Urizen sees them. Urizen sees them as a threat, as fiery, which then causes the Eternals to see Urizen as a threat, or as searching for a solid without fluctuation. So the initial state of the Eternals as, quote, expanding and contracting is quickly challenged by the binary introduced when Urizen and the Eternals perceive one another and react. This reciprocally creates the very shadow they both abhor. So it's a very strange poem in this sense, right? We are being told that this is a sort of linear narrative, but it's only a linear narrative retroactively after it has happened, because it's actually a simultaneous event that is being repeated, that's being made more and more complex every time that it's repeated, and then it's sort of congealing into this truth, right? Which is how Alt would talk about it. This truth that actually becomes another perspective. So each of these perspectives overlap and combine. In particular, the void is common to both U1 and U2. while flexibility and energy are common to both E1 and E2. These overlaps lead to the multiplying of perspectives and the emergence of Los as a compound perspective. Los's compound perspective combines chapter 1 and chapter 2, which then becomes what occurs in chapter 3. Chapter 3 narrates what is essentially the same actions as chapter 1 and 2, but from a radically different and derivative perspective. So it becomes like sort of a thing when we're introduced to the beating heart. Ault sees it as a composite image, which is the version of the total action of the poem up to this point. So the heart is literally sort of the materialization of these perspectives into a form of ontology. Next slide. And this is sort of, from Urizen. And a roof, vast, petrific around on all sides, he framed like a womb, where thousands of rivers and veins of blood poured down the mountains to cool, the eternal fires beating without from eternals, and like a black globe viewed by the sons of eternity, standing on the shore of the infinite ocean, like a human heart struggling and beating, the vast world of Urizen appeared. Whenever I read this, I feel like I'm listening to like heavy metal or death metal or something. The opposing dynamics of the various perspectives appearing in chapter 1 and 2, U1, U2, E1, and E2, appear as a single solid form to E2 of U1, who no longer sees the previous perspectives as distinct. The heart marks a shift in the complexity of Urizen's narrative. Later perspectives can no longer experience earlier perspectives separately, but must treat them as part of a larger infrastructure constructed and then presupposed by the E2 of U1 compound perspective, who is revealed as Los 1, or in Ault's notation, Los 1 equals E2 of U1. So Ault says, Urizen, who literally separates himself from Los in this action, as the Eternals initially did, is separated from him by a void space, as being a dark demon, obscure and unorganized. Next slide. So I'm going to end my reading of Ault's mathematical scenography here. It's a very strange essay. It's an essay that gets more complex as he introduces more and more complex variables. And it's also an essay that he revises. He writes Problems of Perspective in 1972, but even when I knew him I met him in 2003, he was still working on this project. And so generations of his students actually saw this project at different stages, and it was never published. So Bill Rugg in 1998 responds to this work and says that he suspects that perspectives prior to that of Los were actually not more homogeneous or unified than subsequent perspectives. Rugg explains that, quote, the various entities that make up eternity cross these lines of instability and thus enter different fields, some of them self-organizing, some of them increasingly chaotic, which they transform by entering, but which continuously transform them by virtue of disturbance at other points. Rugg ultimately concludes that Urizen may not be an entity at all, but, quote, the horizon of a particular structure or field, a bifurcation point that bounds the condition of possibility of what exists in that field. And so this is sort of the ultimate, I think, version of recasting entities and characters as relations, right? That Blake is constantly asking us to rethink how we understand objects and people and think of them in terms of process, to use Whitehead's term, right? Think of them as in terms of a becoming, if you would invoke Deleuze. And so it's not, so it's a very interesting space in the sense like we are constantly being forced, Blake is telling us, into thinking of things as objects, as entities, as as ongoing, when in fact they're always impermanent, they are always changing, they are always processing and falling apart. So, next slide. Facts also enter into zones of instability. The fields of media archaeology and textual studies enable us to extend this question of fact stability into those of digital preservation. Latour reminds us that facts, quote, have to be kept up, cared for, accompanied, restored, duplicated, saved, yes, saved, we know that for our hard disks, and we still act as if facts could be hard forever at no cost without making any backups, end quote. So few facts underscore this fragility more dramatically than the small bundle of unpublished essays by Ault and his students on the mathematical analysis of Blake's Urizen. The essays were photocopied, then bound together in a plastic ring with blue cardstock for the cover. Ault gave me the bundle late in my PhD program at the University of Florida when he was considering publishing the essays as an appendix to a second edition of Visionary Physics. This new edition was never published. It has existed since then in the closet of my bedroom, stacked with books and articles I had printed and set aside. So it's difficult to consider the fragility of facts when confronted with so many challenges to higher education: fascism, artificial intelligence, and climate change. What fields of chaos must Ault's now out-of-print books traverse to persist? Is my binder the only copy of this essay that exists? I really don't know. Are there others stored on a hard drive somewhere or taking up space in a forgotten closet? Both of Ault's major books, Visionary Physics and Narrative Unbound, are archived on the University of Florida's institutional repository as a series of JPEGs associated with metadata. A PDF version is promised on this site, but it leads to a 404 error. Copyright for the digitized version of Ault's out-of-publication books is held by the Board of Trustees of the University of Florida. And this is problematic, right? Because according to a November 5th, 2021 article by the Tampa Bay Times, 4 members of Florida's board gave a collective $661,800 to the campaign of Governor Ron DeSantis. By contrast, most of Latour's articles and presentations in different languages are available on brunolatour.fr, and Latour's estate holds the copyright. While it is difficult to predict how long a fact can endure, it seemed that France's more liberal government, along with relatively more resources devoted to preserving Latour scholarship, makes the facts he presents more durable. This durability reminds us that science is not real, as Claire Colebrook puts it. If by real we mean that which, quote, would block totalitarianism, force your neighbors to behave the way they ought to, in the unbridled infodemic of unbounded alternative facts, and allow us to get along and be kind. It is real in the sense that it is constructed, and it's fragile, and it's perishing, and it's dependent on institutions that support it, right? The fact is not an ahistorical weapon. It is a perishing, changing, shifting actor. We must all take seriously Latour's insight that the fact altering alters all. Thank you.